I'd love for you to tell me why it is so important to plan before you start writing.
Well, think of it like going on a trip. If you have no idea what your destination is and you just start driving, you could end up anywhere, probably not where you were trying to go. So you need to have a plan. First of all, you need to know what your destination is. You need to know what is your big idea? What's the thing you're trying to get across? And then you need to have an idea of how all of these pieces are going to fit together. What are you going to start with? What's the next thing? What's the structure of these ideas? What are the elements of them? And then when you actually go to write, it's easy because it's like, oh, okay, now I'm working on part 3 of my 5-part structure. That's very well defined. People who just sit and start typing end up with a big blob of repetitive, sort of ill-defined goo, and then they hate themselves. It's like, oh my God, I'm a terrible writer. No, you're not a terrible writer. Anyone who started writing without a plan would end up with the same pile of goo. So you plan first, then anybody can be a good writer at that point.
What does it take to put your life's work out there in a really big way? How much can I do with this one precious life? Welcome to The Selfish Gift.
Okay, so you've decided to write your nonfiction book about whatever your topic of expertise is, but how do you get started? It's hard to start even from square one when you don't even know what square one looks like. My guest today has a wealth of useful advice that will help you to lay a strong foundation for your book and avoid those costly, time-wasting mistakes. Josh Bernoff is a freelance ghostwriter, editor, and publishing consultant. And he's also the best-selling author of 4 books of his own, including Writing Without Bullshit, Boost Your Career by Saying What You Mean, which was published by Harper Business in 2016. Josh is a former analyst at Forrester Research and I think a VP, right?
That's right, senior VP.
Okay. Okay, senior VP, SVP. So, and Josh works primarily with business book authors, and he also delivers workshops on how to write with clarity for companies that you might have heard of, like Netflix, Disney, GE, Salesforce, and others. His blog is Writing Without Bullshit, and it has been viewed more than 3 million times. So, Josh, hey, hi. Thanks for joining me.
Maggie, it's great to be here.
I just want to cut right to the chase. So I asked a rhetorical question in the intro, how do you start? So I know and you know that writers should not just dive in with the writing. They need to start with a plan. So let's just cut right to the chase with that. I'd love for you to tell me why it is so important to plan before you start writing.
Well, think of it like going on a trip. If you have no idea what your destination is and you just start driving, you could end up anywhere, probably not where you were trying to go. So you need to have a plan. First of all, you need to know what your destination is. You need to know what is your big idea? What's the thing you're trying to get across? And then you need to have an idea of how all of these pieces are going to fit together. What are you going to start with? What's the next thing? What's the structure of these ideas? What are the elements of them? And then when you actually go to write, it's easy because it's like, oh, okay, now I'm working on part 3 of my 5-part structure. That's very well defined. People who just sit and start typing end up with a big blob of repetitive, sort of ill-defined goo, and then they hate themselves. It's like, oh my God, I'm a terrible writer. No, you're not a terrible writer. Anyone who started writing without a plan would end up with the same pile of goo. So you plan first, then anybody can be a good writer at that point.
That's a great reality check. That people blame themselves when really they just haven't set themselves up for success. And you have a super useful system for creating that plan, because it sounds easy, right? Sure, have a plan, but what does that plan look like? How do you develop it? Can you tell us? Well, first, actually, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what the plan is, I'd love to know why we should listen to you. Tell us a bit more about who you are and how you came to know all of this incredibly valuable wisdom.
Well, you should listen to me because I've got the mileage that the experience that will basically help you with this. I'll start quickly and let you know that in 20 years as an analyst at Forrester Research, at Forrester, we were charging people significant amounts of money for those research reports. So it was a really rigorous process to get in there, only the most valuable ideas and delivered as clearly and simply as possible. So that was sort of my real training. And then since leaving there, actually, while I was there, I edited 3 books and co-wrote 2. And then after that, I've done more than 25 book projects, ghostwriting projects, editing projects, coaching on all sorts of topics, autobiographies, business books about cybersecurity, basically just about anything you can think of as nonfiction. So I've seen everything that can go wrong from writers, although I have to admit every time a new project comes up, I'm like, oh, you found a way to fail that I hadn't seen before. But I passionately want these people's ideas to get out into the world in the most positive way possible. And that means I need to diagnose where their issue is, diagnose why they're having a problem, and then, whether I'm editing or coaching or whatever, give them the necessary advice to be able to communicate what they want to say clearly to their audience.
In fact, you've said that your mission is I kind of love this, to rid the world of bullshit one writer at a time, which is pretty high hill to climb.
Yes, it is. Wow.
Well, tell me why does this matter to you?
Well, I sort of want to divide it into 2 pieces. The book Writing Without Bullshit was specifically for people in corporations, because everybody in corporations writes. You're writing emails, you're writing reports, you're writing, memos, or attempting to persuade people of stuff. And there is so much self-serving fluff in there. It just wastes a huge amount of people's time. I did an actual analysis of this using the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and estimated that the total amount of wages paid for time wasted from poorly written material is $396 billion every year. So
what?
that's just in the United States.
Bullshit is expensive.
So that's the corporate side of it. Now, if you're an author, you have a much higher bar. You're writing 30,000, 40,000, 60,000 words that are intended to persuade somebody of something. This is the right way to do coding. This is the right way to think about the stock market, whatever it happens to be. And so those people have a much higher demand on clarity, and that's sort of a big, juicy project. It's not just a 3-page memo. So that, to me, by the way, I'll just tell you, if I am writing or editing, it makes me happy. If I'm doing that, I'm happy. If I'm doing something else, like sending out invoices, I'm much less happy. So I just love that, because at the end of that process, the person will say, oh, wow, that's what I really wanted to say. And now people will understand it, and that makes me happy.
I'm the same way. It's kind of like, if I was into car mechanics, this would be tinkering under the hood, that satisfaction of making something run smoothly. But the thing that we're making run smoothly is a sentence or a paragraph or a chapter or a manuscript. And it's so rewarding. Mm-hmm. And I think it's more important than ever, because first of all, I think there's more writing in the world going on right now, what with social media, blogging, and people needing to have some sort of content that's out there. And at the same time, the world of business book authors has just kind of mushroomed and exploded. Everybody seems to feel like they need to have a book as a calling card. And it's not just business books, it's people in all kinds of fields, not necessarily writing about business, but writing about whatever their work is, whether that's, they're a therapist or they're a dietitian or whatever. Everybody's writing a book right now. And I think the sheer volume of material being produced can sometimes seduce people into thinking that it's easy, or that it should be easy. And it just is not. Yeah.
Well, it is way easier than it ever has been to publish a crappy book.
Oh, right, exactly.
and that means that if you want to write a book, you need to distinguish it from the crappy books. Now, you can start by having a nice looking cover, but once you get past that, it ought to be powerful and persuasive, and more important than anything else, it ought to be something that people read and then say, hey, you got to go look at this thing that Maggie just wrote, or you got to go look at this thing that this other guy just wrote, and it spreads. Well, that's not going to happen unless it's really well done, and that's what I want to help with.
Right. I always say that your goal is to write a book that people will buy, read, and recommend. It's got to be that good. Okay, so back to the plan. Tell us about your system for planning out a book.
Okay, so there are 3 parts to this. So you want to start to write a book. First thing you do is start typing. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. Stop typing. Typing is not the first thing to do. The first thing to do is to figure out what the idea is, and that idea has to be differentiated. So it's not enough to say my idea is about how to write better code. No, there are lots of books on that. Maybe your idea is how to write code that runs efficiently in the cloud. Okay, that might be differentiated. So who is your audience, and what are you trying to persuade them of? What will they know after they read what you've written that they didn't know before? What will they do as a result of knowing that? And then what will they think of you as a teacher and author? I do these sort of brainstorming sessions with authors and another person to clarify those ideas. And part of that is to listen to the sort of magic words that people use that haven't been used before, and then look and see if that could be a good book title or subtitle.
Is that other person a therapist?
No. My description for the third person, they're sort of a sounding board. They should represent the audience. So that third person has to be intelligent and creative and not married to the author.
Great. Okay.
And because you want someone who can tell you the truth and not have a relationship problem as a result. So the result of this work is that you get basically a page to a page and a half. I call it a treatment. It's equivalent to the flap copy you'd read on the book. And yeah, I'm telling people, write the flap copy before you write the book, because that makes a bunch of promises. This is the first book that does this and this and this. Then all you have to do is actually write it to deliver on those promises. So that gives you a destination. That is your North Star. It tells you what direction to go. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to develop a plan for the book. And that basically is a table of contents. Chapter 1 is always to scare the crap out of your chapter. You read chapter 1, at the end of chapter 1, you should either say, I better pay attention to this or something bad will happen. That's fear. Or, I better pay attention to this because I could make a whole lot of success and money from it. That's greed. You can have either one or both, fear or greed in chapter 1. And then you lay out what's the justification for your idea, what are the steps that are involved, how does it apply in different industries, what do you do first and second and third. There's a lot of different ways to structure it, but there has to be some sort of recognizable structure that tells you why chapter 4 comes after chapter 3 and before chapter 5.
And you put that signposting into chapter 1.
Well, you can, yeah. At the end of chapter 1, I usually say, here's what you're going to read that's coming up here.
Oh, okay. But when you were listing those other elements, you were talking about you go on to the next chapter to do this and so on and so on.
So I'm saying make yourself a spreadsheet. Give me titles for each of the chapters that come after that. And then I want to know for each chapter, what's the research that backs this up? What diagrams might be in there? What are the case studies that you might be using, or the stories that you're going to tell? They could be stories that happened to you, or they could be stories of famous business people or people that you interviewed. What statistics you might include. And so you'll have a column in this spreadsheet for each chapter for each of those items. Once you have done that, you are in an excellent position to get started. And this is where you can move on to step 3, which is to write a chapter. And when I say write a chapter, that's not chapter 1. You don't start with chapter 1. You start with whatever is the easiest chapter. You're like, well, I'm really excited about this chapter about the history of nutrition. Okay. Mm-hmm. Then write that. And that becomes a template. Once that's done, you're like, oh, I see what it takes to do a chapter. Okay, now I can do all of the other chapters in a way that matches up to that. So if you have those pieces, if you have the destination, right, the plan, the idea nailed down, that's the first piece. The second piece is that spreadsheet of what's going to be in each chapter. And the third piece is that sample chapter. You have that, Now writing will actually be much easier.
I always like to advise authors to start with the one that feels clearest in their mind. So, you said that you're most excited about, similarly, just the one that feels like it's going to be the easiest to write, because once you kind of unstop the dam and get yourself kind of limbered up in the writing process, it is so much easier. Okay, thank you. That's an awesome process. And I have to say, I am a bullet pointer. I never have used a spreadsheet for that, but maybe that's just personal preference. But I think it makes a ton of sense. But, what about when people are looking at their spreadsheet and there's the blinking cursor and they're like, I don't know what to put into that field. Do you have any tips on how to think about the content mix or get a good flow of ideas? I mean, I love that you were saying, then you justify your statements, then tell me, what advice you have in terms of choosing what to put in those darn boxes.
So one piece of advice is to take the pieces that you have and sort of distribute them among these chapters. So a lot of people will say, all right, well, I actually have like these 6 case studies that I'm doing. I'm doing this with an author right now, actually. I'm like, she had a sort of set of chapters that were stream of consciousness. And I said, I won't even work with you until you can make a list of all the stories you have. And sure enough, she created this long list of stories. And then I'm like, okay, which chapter does each of these stories go into? Because sometimes you're like, oh, this could go in chapter 3 or chapter 4. Well, if chapter 4 doesn't have any other stories, then we'll put it in chapter 4. And that applies to research, statistics, reasoning, diagrams, anything else. You can sort of distribute them among what you've got. And you can see gaps. It's like, I don't have any story for chapter 2. Who can I interview that would demonstrate this thing that I want to have in chapter 2? The other thing is to recognize that all writing, including business writing, is stories. I have to say, I learned from my first agent, John Taylor Williams, Ike Williams at Kinnearman Williams. I submitted this was back when I was working at Forrester. I submitted this book proposal, and he said, this isn't going to sell. And I said, why not? And he said, business books are made of people and stories, and there's no people and stories in here. It reads like research reports. And I was like, oh, I could do that. Okay. So now let's say you're looking at chapter 3 and you want to know what's the story of chapter 3. Well, you want to start with a problem. What happens with this? How do I solve this problem? Give me some evidence. Give me some case studies or whatever that describe that problem. Give me a principle. Okay, based on this, you can see here's this principle, and then give me the elements of that solution. And you can repeat some of those, but it has to have the problem and the solution. The other thing, this is not a requirement, but this is like my favorite way to do it, is to start each chapter right in the midst of a case study. It's like, so if you look at the first book that I co-wrote, the first sentence of the first book was, Rick Clancy seemed worried. And you're like,
oh no, I need to know what's wrong with Rick.
Yeah, what's and then it says, he was the head of public relations for Sony Corporation, one of the most powerful marketing people on the planet. But he was concerned because now his company was saying, you need to start a blog. And then you're like, well, what did he do? What was that like? What was he worried about? How did he solve the, okay, now you've sucked people in. And here's a secret that people don't realize, which is if you start with a story and you get to the end of the story and you have a happy ending of the story, now people are like, oh, I see what happened with Rick. Whatever you have in the next 2 sentences, people will believe. If you say after that, the lesson of this is, it's like, oh, that must be true. Because people are all nice and happy and warm and comfortable because they've read this story. And then they're like, oh, okay, that story, the moral of the story is this. That must be true. So it's a great way to start a chapter because at the end of that, people are ready to believe whatever you have to say.
It makes sense. We're human beings. Story is how we make sense of our own lives and the world around us. And it makes sense that it would build credibility and trust there. You have a device that I love the name of. You call it the FAT outline. And I'd love to know what you mean by a FAT outline and where that comes into play in the book planning process.
Okay. So a FAT outline is for a longer piece of work. It could be a chapter. It could be a blog post, anything that's, probably more than about 700 words long and up to maybe, 4, 5, 6,000 words. So let's say it's a book chapter. Okay. So now what am I going to put into this book chapter? So what I'm going to suggest that people do is you're like, okay, let's suppose this book chapter is about, how the whole book is about the cloud, and this is about how the cloud applies in human resources. Just making this stuff up. Okay, so now you got statistics, you have stories, whatever. Just dump it all into a file, Google Doc or Microsoft Word file. Now you organize it. Let's turn it into a story. What comes first? We'll put the case study up here. Then we'll have this part. Then we're going to have the diagram. Oh, wait, this would come earlier. This would come later. And, it's a word processor. You can move things around any way you want. And that's very low stress. Because if you're doing that and you say, wait, this should come before that, you just copy and paste, right? And I always say, I have all this advice about avoiding passive voice and overgeneralizations and so on. But when you're doing the FAT outline, none of that stuff matters. You don't worry about grammar. It can be in all different fonts. You can paste pictures in there. You can do drawings. It doesn't matter. All you're doing is trying to arrange the elements that are going to be in the chapter in the order that makes sense. Okay, now the FAT outline is done. Have you written the chapter? No, because you can't turn that in. It's actually useful if you're working with an editor. You say, this is what I think I'm going to write. And they say, oh, all right, this is what's good about that. This doesn't follow here, whatever. Okay, now it's time to write. Now all you have to do is turn the crappy material in the outline into good material. Okay, first I have to write this part. Type. Oh, okay, now I have to write this part. Now I have to write this part. All of the stress associated with writing is gone, and you can concentrate on words and sentences and paragraphs and how that all fits together. So that works very well at getting people from the blank page to an actual written chapter. Whereas if you just sit down and start typing, you'll get yourself into a corner. You will repeat things. You'll realize you forgot something. We're not working with quill pens here. You don't have to write everything in order from the beginning to the end. If you have that FAT outline, you have a plan for what you're going to be doing.
Do you ever work with subheads as sort of shorthand for organizing your chapter structure?
That subheads are a perfect thing to put into the FAT outline. Absolutely. You can take, if there's 29 things in the FAT outline, then maybe there's a subhead and that's followed by 3 or 4 things and another subhead followed by 3 or 4 things. But I want to make it clear the difference between an outline and a FAT outline. If you say, all right, here are the subheads in my chapter, there's going to be 5 subheads, and under these 5 subheads, here's 3, minor heads are going to be under those. Okay. And you just have the titles of those. You have done no work at all. Okay.
That's a little
because
harsh.
now you have to actually type it and you're like, well, yeah, but what goes in here? No, the FAT outline has actual content in it. It has stuff in it. Here's where the GE case study goes. And you're much further along with that than if you do the traditional outline. Traditional outlines are easy to create and useless.
Well, how do you really feel? That's
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you wanted the opinianated version of me. You're getting the real version.
I do.
Okay.
That's good. It's all good. No, it's just that that I don't know if they're useless, but maybe they're not quite enough.
You do it your way. That's fine.
There you go. Okay. That's true for all of us, by the way. That's right. Speaking of doing it your way. So I work with authors who love outlines and feel comfortable in that world and who can generate a very lucid, clear, cohesive outline that makes sense and goes from top to bottom in a way that flows and moves forward. And then there are those who say, I just can't do it. I just can't think that way. I need to just start writing in order to find what I have in my head. I think of them as kitchen sink thinkers or junk drawer thinkers, where it just, it's almost like tipping all the puzzle pieces out on the table. And I got to look and see I don't even know if there's blue sky or hills in this picture yet. I've got to put them all out there. How do you help those folks?
Well, I want to tell you, I learned this concept from my son, who writes fiction occasionally, and he helped me to learn that there are two kinds of people, planners and pantsers. So planners are writers who have everything planned out and then they write according to the plan, and pantsers are people who write by the seat of their pants. And in fiction, I can understand that. Mm-hmm. Now, in nonfiction, yes, you still have planners and pantsers. And what I'm going to say is that for some people, the fat outline is their first draft. We're just going to put all the bits and pieces here and move them around. For pantsers, if the only way you can get it out of your head is to type, that's fine. Type. You end up with a big pile of stuff that's probably not in the right order and has repetition and so on. And as long as you understand that the purpose of that is to get it out on the page and create what I guess what Anne Lamott would call the crappy first draft, shitty first draft, right? That's fine, as long as you realize that you've done the same thing that the fat outline creator did, which was to get a whole bunch of stuff down on the page. Now you can go back, organize it, think about what belongs where, and actually write something that people would want to read.
Yeah. And what I find is challenging. I've worked with, successfully with both of those kinds of people, and both of them have a pathway to completion. It can work. The difference is the more unnecessary words you generate, the harder a slog it is to organize it. And I think what you're saying about the fat outline is like, you want to get the gist of it down without having, a page and a half for each point, and then you get lost in the sauce so quickly when that's the case.
Here's a practical consideration. Okay. If you give your first crappily written draft to the editor, they have to slog through it too. Yeah, and then they have to figure out what has to happen as a result of that. And then they need to give you a recommendation. Editors
and your intention might not even be clear to them.
Right.
So
that's the intelligence of the editor to figure that out. But that's expensive. Mm-hmm. Editors may or may not charge by the hour, but if they know they're going to have to do that, they're going to be like, okay, each chapter is going to cost you $3,500. Wow. If you just wrote an outline that they could get through in 45 minutes, then that's not going to be nearly as expensive to get that feedback. So if you really want to put your editor through that, well, you're going to pay for that.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Now, Josh, you mostly or only write in the business space. I mean, this kind of outlining process, I know that it works really well for any kind of practical nonfiction book, an information-based book, whether that's, about parenting, meditation, or anything else under the sun. But some books follow kind of different structural rules. A journalistic book might be differently structured. Certainly a book that tells any kind of narrative, whether that's like, the story of a movement or the story of a person. But you mentioned that you've worked on autobiographies as well, which frankly kind of surprises me. I didn't know that about you. I thought you were strictly in the business book space, but tell me how you're, how or can you apply that same advice and process to a narrative-based piece of writing?
Well, I actually had a great experience recently with a guy named Mitch Lowe. He was a founder of Netflix. He was the president of Redbox, had a huge impact on the video industry, and his life story is one of the most fascinating things I ever was associated with. You can buy that book now. It hasn't come out yet, but you can pre-order it. It's called Watch and Learn. And so he had all these incredible experiences, and his process, I mean, we we mapped out chapter by chapter what was going to be in there. It was in a chronological sequence because for an autobiography, that is pretty much the only reasonable way to do it. But it was like, okay, what is the lesson of what happened to you when you were in your 20s, or what are people supposed to learn from what happened during the challenges that you had in this startup that you did. And his process was to do dictation and then try and assemble it. And the result of that was chapters that were complete, but there was a fair amount of repetition and some of the sentences didn't work and there was tenses shifting around and all of that. But I was thrilled because the raw material was just insanely interesting and wacky, and he had a nice fluid style. And I'm like, okay, these are all just word and paragraph things. These are easy things for an editor to fix. Whereas if someone comes to you with a boring story and says, edit this, it's still going to be boring by the time you finish editing it.
Yeah.
Boring is boring. So yeah, I think even in an autobiography, organizing it that way, what's going to be in this chapter, what pieces are going to be in there, what stories am I going to tell? That still makes sense to do it that way.
And as well as what I heard you say in there is it's not just about like, okay, we're talking about the 70s. So I guess I'll just tell all the stories that fit in the 70s. What you were talking about, like kind of almost like the moral of the story or the takeaway or the lesson learned, as you put it. And that's, I suppose, akin to, a piece of information that advances the underlying, sort of framework that's being explored in the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at what I would call not just tell-all type autobiographies, if you're telling an autobiography of a baseball player, I mean, we want to hear about what happened in the game against the Phillies in 1983. But for these kinds of sort of idea-based people, if you look at an autobiography like Tony Hsieh's autobiography about Zappos, they want you to believe, okay, I've learned things in my life. They're important and valuable things, and I want you to understand the lessons that I've learned. And that means you do need to think about what are the ideas and not just sort of the prurient, here's what happened when I slept with Shirley MacLaine kind of thing.
You did?
Don't tell my wife. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Side note, my father used to tell me, don't tell your mother, but she's not your real mother. Your real mother is Shirley MacLaine. She doesn't know.
Okay, I see. I had no idea. All right.
I didn't know you
don't
didn't
worry,
know
it'll
Shirley
be our
MacLaine's
secret.
daughter. Yeah, thank you.
That'll be our secret. Yes.
Well, I think even if you're not a famous founder, people still want to see the reflections, what you have learned from. So even if, you're just an ordinary everyday person, but you're writing about some remarkable journey or journey of insight that you've experienced, your stories need to be purposeful. And that is true for every piece of personal narrative nonfiction, that there needs to be some sort of insight and reflection. It can't just be and then this happened and then that happened and then that happened. It's just that does not make it an interesting story, no matter who you are.
Yeah.
Okay, so since we're talking about stories, talk to me for a minute about case studies. You mentioned that earlier, starting with a case study. Advice on, conducting interviews, collecting and using case studies. It's a really big sticking point for a lot of people who are new to writing.
Yeah, there's definitely a right way to do this. And the challenge is that when you're collecting the information for a case study, if you forget something, it's often really difficult or even impossible to go back and get it. So you got to have this stuff in your mind. So all case studies are the same. They're all like, there was this person in this company and they had this problem and this was the nature of the problem. This is how they felt. And then they tried this to solve the problem and that didn't work. And then they tried this and that seemed to work better. And then they realized they could go further with it. And then, that it was transformation, and oh, by the way, here's a number that showed, they increased sales by 20%, or they decreased costs by 15%, or they were able to hire people in half as much time, or whatever it happened to be. And then usually it ends with, and then they all lived happily ever after. Sometimes it's a tragic ending, and then it's like, we tried this and then something bad happened. Sometimes you have to write those case studies from public sources because those people won't talk to you. But if you're conducting an interview, you don't have to do it in that order, but you need to be thinking. First of all, you have to turn a person into a human being, right? So, for example, in one book I ghost wrote, I wrote about a guy who was an executive at Dish Network, and he happened to be of Indian background. And he became really interested in satellite television because his parents used to watch the Hindi channel on satellite TV, and he became exposed to that. And he was like, okay, so I'm really excited about this. So I just was able to turn him into an actual character, not just a name on the page, because you're like, oh, here he is with his mom watching these soap operas in Hindi, right?
To give some personal dimension to the,
right. Yeah. And it's interesting. You don't want to, this should not start with, he was 5'8" and weighed 293 pounds, unless it's about weight loss. But you just need a few of those little details. She's always been interested in marketing ever since she saw the first commercials about Alka-Seltzer, or something like that. So now we have a human being, and then it's like, usually there's some sort of a challenge they need to face because something changed. Okay. The internet came along, and then they had to change the way they did business, or they had, like I said about Rick Clancy, it's like, oh my gosh, I have to write a blog. I don't know anything about social media. So now this human being has a real problem. You're like, oh God, what are they going to do? This sounds challenging.
I'm invested in their outcome.
Right. And then, really bad case study is, so then they decided to do this, and that worked, and then everything was fine. And you're like, yeah, that's, in Act 2, we sort of would like to know some sort of a challenge that they faced. And typically the first thing they try doesn't work, or they try it and then they learn, oh, it's not this, it's that. But there's some sort of an insight that comes to pass. And often, at the end of this, it's like, okay, well then as a result of that, they got promoted to senior vice president, or the company was able to duplicate that in 7 other departments or something like that. So the message you're giving to the reader is, oh, I'll see if you do this, then you'll succeed in your career just like she did. And I think this is interesting. And working with one young writer that I worked with, I realized that this was an insight I had that I'd never externalized, which is, you want to keep the story separate from the concepts. So the story is fine the way it is. Okay, they had this problem, they tried to solve this problem, and then this. And then after that, you get into, okay, well, what can we learn from what happened with Sarah and the marketing department? And here is where you lay out this. And it's interesting because this is where the subtle message is, oh, this writer's really sharp. Wow, they saw something here that other people didn't see. You're not storytelling now. Now you're pontificating, I guess you might say. And as I said before, people will believe whatever you say that comes right after that. But if you mix these lessons in with the story, it dilutes the story. And then when the story's over, it's hard to know, what do you do after that?
Right. You've already blown your wad. Right.
And there's sort of a right length to these things. So
tell us what that is, Josh.
I'd say it's probably somewhere between 700 words and 2,000 words. If you
For
have
a case study, that's pretty long, man.
Yeah. Well, I think if you have it going on longer than that, then it's difficult for people to get their head around it. Yeah, 2,000 words would be pretty long. And sometimes you get the same people coming back over and over again. It's like, oh, here he is again in chapter 6.
Yeah, you can have an extended case study where you show sort of phases of the situation as it evolves.
But you got to be careful with that. I know, like in my first book that I wrote with Charlene Lee about social media, we had Dell computer in there maybe 4 times. And we had a whole bunch of other stuff. But that was like, you didn't want this to be, oh, well, here's a story of how Dell computer uses social media. That's not really that interesting. So you need to just mix it up. In fact, I often would do a chart, and it's like, what countries are these taking place in? What departments are they? What's the gender of the protagonist? I don't want to be only white men succeeding here. I'd like to see some women. I'd like to see some people who aren't white. What industries, what departments? Just, you want to have as much diversity as you can, because the person reading it says, "Oh, I'm in human resources in a company in France." They want to have something to read about a company in Europe, or a human resource executive in some other company.
Different ways into the material. Yeah. I've seen those extended case studies work well in books that are kind of more about the personal realm. Like, for example, like a book on, sort of making marriage work or something sort of healing your inner child wounds or whatever. It can sometimes follow 1 or 2 of these character case studies through the development of material. And I think that there's less of that concern of, putting too much of a spotlight on Dell and making it a book about Dell.
Well, anyone who has a book like that should work with you and not me, because I don't know anything about personal relationships. I would not edit that book.
You've been married a lot longer than I ever was. So anyway,
my advice for personal relationships is choose the right person, and then everything else is easy after that. Oh, you choose the wrong person, everything else is impossible. So
great, Josh. So I guess your advice for writing books is have a great idea. Okay, that's easier said than done.
That's why I advise business authors and not people who have relationship issues.
Fair enough. So I guess, getting back to the interview, what you're saying is that you need to start with your sort of list of ingredients in mind, so that you're capturing each of those things and asking the right questions. Otherwise, if you go into an interview just saying, tell me about your job, or tell me about that moment in time when you guys were fighting that, problem. And then you might wind up with just like a really long-winded story with really only 1 or 2 of the components in it and no good nuggets.
I'll mention one other thing, because people are like, where do you find them? And when I was an analyst, it was easy, because we had all these clients, and I'm like, oh, can we tell your story? Oh yeah, that'd be great. But like this book that I ghostwrote on artificial intelligence and customer service was an issue. And then I realized, if a person has already been quoted in a publication talking about this, you're like, oh, I see here. It's Intercontinental Hotel Group, and here's the guy who did it. Well, if you contact the PR for that company, or if you can get directly to the person and say, hey, this sounds like you're doing something really interesting, I'd like to write about it in my book, you're probably going to get a yes. So, and at this point, you don't have to say, so what happened? You're like, oh, yes, as I read in Retail Week, it sounded like you did this and this and this. Can you tell me more about what it took to do that?
That right there, that's the gold. That's the kind of nugget that is so useful, Josh. That's really super great advice, because I know that people come up against that all the time. They're looking at like, okay, well, I'm looking at my own client base, and most of whom maybe don't want me to talk about the work that we did together. Right. And then there's all those like famous examples that have just been over reported. So yeah, okay, great advice. Now, I'd like to ask you about mistakes. Aside from failing to plan, what's the biggest sort of mistake that you see authors make?
Mistakes, I've made a few, but then again, too few to mention. Okay, so mistakes that authors make. Oh my gosh, I could write a whole book on that. I think maybe I will.
I think you will. I think you will.
I think, yes. So, failing to have a differentiated idea, right? Then anything you do after that is going to be a big mess.
Yeah.
I would say that just a general failure to plan is an issue. But if you look at actual writing that people do, I think that there are certain things that are deadly. All chapters are made out of the same sort of components: research, stories, statistics, insights, graphics, and so on, and justification. And justification is, let me explain how I know this.
Mm-hmm.
If more than about 15% of the chapter is justification, then you're going to put the reader right to sleep. It's like, oh my God, this guy will just not shut up about this thing. And it's just unsupported statement after unsupported statement after unsupported statement. And you're like, okay. And if you do a whole book of those, it's called a manifesto. And in general, they're way too long and pretty tiresome.
Mm-hmm.
So I once edited a book, really fascinating book, expert authors, full of really interesting insights, and the entire book was written in the passive voice.
Okay, I know that's a bugbear of yours, and rightly so. It's terrible.
Every single sentence was in the passive voice, and I had to go and rewrite and it's sort of amazing because I rewrote every sentence in the passive voice into the active voice, and then it was like, wow, this is really good. Right?
Yeah.
Because they had all of the right material. That wasn't a problem I couldn't have fixed that problem. But this is sort of, I want to explain why this is. So if I say in the book that all code must be audited, well, that's like, I'm sitting way above the problem, and we know something has to be done. And then the person's like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. But whose job is that?
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden this sort of general advice is useless. Whereas if you write that in the active voice, you might say, there should be a quality assurance department. It should have these 7 types of people in it. And the quality assurance department should audit the code before in the first revision, and then this time and then that time. And I'm making this all up. I don't know if it's true, but see, now the person reading it is like, oh, I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that happens when you write in the active voice is you often use the word you, meaning the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what you need to do. You need to hire this kind of people. You need to think about this in 3 steps. Now, all of a sudden, the reader can't be like, oh, okay, that sounds interesting. It's like, oh, crap, I have to do something here. Oh, starts taking notes. Okay, I better do this. Then I better do that. Now you have a book that actually is full of useful advice. And even if it's the same advice you had written in the passive voice, by using the word you and writing directly to the reader, you involve people and they're like, oh, that was really useful. So that's a little trick to make it a little bit more
so
direct
important,
and
it's really widespread. I think partly, or maybe largely, because it's sort of it's sort of, I don't know, part of like business writing style to write in passive voice, especially if you look at press releases. I don't know quite why that is, but it's some sort of like impersonal, arm's length. We're just talking about the thing. We're not talking about people, or,
it's fear. People are afraid of taking responsibility. As your people listening to this podcast may know, or as anyone who reads my blog knows, I'm fairly direct. But people respond to that. They respond to directness because it's so different from all the bullshit that we're used to experiencing. If someone comes to you and says, all right, here's what you got to do, you're like, okay, I'm going to start listening because this sounds like it's important. Now, I don't mean direct, like, okay, you're ugly and stupid. That's direct, but that's not useful. But if I'm like, here's what you need to do, then people will listen.
And then we also, I think we talked earlier about the oft underestimated job of promoting the book being a really big mistake that a lot of authors make.
Okay, yes. Well, I've had this experience over and over and over again, where people at the beginning of a book writing process, they're like, oh God, what am I going to do? I don't know. How do we organize it? Then we get part way into it and they're writing and they're like, okay, this is really hard. Oh, wait, here's another thing I need to learn. Oh, we should have gotten permission to use this story, all this. And they finally get to the end and they're like, okay, here's this beautiful polished manuscript, which we're going to hand over to somebody like Maggie's company and have them turn it into a book. And I say, well, and they're like, wow, that was great. Look at what we did. Look at what I did. That's fantastic. I'm going to start writing another book right now. And I'm like, no. The book isn't the end point. The book is nothing until people hear about it, which means you need to think, do I need to hire a publicist? How can I write byline articles about this? Am I going to use social media to promote it? Am I going to use Maggie's podcast to promote it? How am I going to keep the buzz up here? Am I going to do public speaking? All of that. And that's how you get the word out and turn the book into a success. And if the next thing you do is start writing another book, then you're not really an author. You're just a typist. So real authors promote.
That's right. And we're going to talk more about promotion and sharing your work in a little minute. But Josh, I want to hear about your experience writing your own books. And there have been 4 of them, one of which was a bestseller. Tell me, you know, having worked with writers and also sitting in that chair yourself, generating something that is coming from your own mind and your own ideas. What did you learn? How did it go?
So maybe I'll just give you some stories from books that I worked on. My first book was a fascinating collaboration. My partner, my co-author, was a woman named Charlene Lee, really brilliant woman who was sort of the lead analyst at Forrester on social media. And I had persuaded the company to allow me to write books as part of my job. So Charlene and I collaborated. In the beginning, most of those ideas in that book came from her, and I did most of the writing. By the time we got to the end, we had developed a lot of the ideas together. And really great case studies in there. It just sort of came together blazingly. We were really happy with it. And then it became a bestseller. It sold 150,000 copies. The title of the book is Groundswell, Winning in a World Transformed by Social Technologies. I don't recommend that anyone read it now because it's about social media from 2008. Things have changed since then.
Things have changed.
But at the time, it was groundbreaking.
Dude, that is a lot of copies.
Yeah, no, it was fantastically successful. And I was like, I know how to write a best-selling book.
Yeah.
Great. So I started to work on the second book with another co-author, and it was not a bestseller. It was sort of a decent seller. And what I realized is all of this stuff about great writing and great case studies and really great idea is fine, but the other thing you need is timing. You need to have the right book at the right moment. Our book on social media came out right at the moment when people were saying, well, what do I do about this? I'm a corporate person. I don't know what to do about it. And they're like, wait a minute. This is full of all sorts of ideas on what to do. It's exactly what I need. Whereas if I wrote a book right now that was called
The Basics of Social Media.
Right. If it was called, How to Succeed on the Internet, you'd be like, oh, come on. That would be the right book for 1998, not the right book for 2022.
Right.
Writing without bullshit really this is the first book I wrote that I didn't have a co-author.
And that was 2016 it came out?
Right. Yeah. So that came out of my personal experience with so much poorly written crap in the business world. And I said, I can fix this. Plus I had a sort of chip on my shoulder. I'm like, let's make this a real smart-assy kind of very provocative book. Maybe the title will give you a clue that that's what that was going to be like. And while it wasn't nearly as successful, it came together very quickly because it was like just what I wanted to say. Also, about 30-40% of the content in that book I had debuted as blog posts and gotten feedback on them. And I'm like, okay, I can see how this is coming together. So I put those pieces together and got that to work. And
you blog a lot. You blog every day. Or is it every weekday?
Well, between 2015 when I started and February of 2022, I did a blog post every weekday. And no, I do not recommend that for people unless you have exactly the same mental deficiencies and weaknesses that I do. It's just a thing that I feel gets me involved. Now, I took a break for a few months after that because I had some personal things with my family that I needed to take care of. And what I found just a couple of weeks ago was I felt like, well, maybe I'm missing this. So I went back and started, I didn't say I'm going to blog every weekday again. I'm like, I'm going to write a post. And then the next day I'm like, oh, I can write another post. And admittedly, half of what I've written in the last 2-3 weeks has been about Elon Musk, but that's not my fault. He just keeps coming out with crappy things worth writing about.
That's not my fault.
Yes. Well, I write about what needs to be written about. Topical matters. And when Elon Musk says we're laying off 10% of our workforce because I feel like it, I'm like, okay, there's a communication that needs to be critiqued, and I'm the guy to do it.
Right.
So, but this is like the rhythm of my life. And the source material is partly things like Elon Musk, but it's also partly my experience. I wrote a post that got published today that's called 31 Million Ways to Ghostwrite a Book. And the reason was because I realized if you have a ghostwriting project, there's all these questions you need to answer. And everyone's like, what's this project like? Well, it's not at all like the other project. What's the source material? How am I going to get paid? And, how are we going to review it? And what's the publishing process? Uh-huh. And as you look at all the combinations and permutations, there's 31 million different ways that project could go.
See, this is where it helps to have a background in mathematics as you do, because right. I would not be calculating all of those different ways.
It's simple multiplication, Maggie.
Yeah,
even math challenged people can do it. So.
No. I saw more than a couple digits there, so okay. I was done.
But basically, if I have an experience in working with authors, or an insight that I've had, or I look at a communication that goes out publicly, like Elon Musk's emails, and say, there's something that can be learned from this. All of that is fodder. And I'll just tell you that I'm a much better writer because of it, because I am writing 1,000 words every single weekday that has to hang together and be interesting. And that's a way to get the juices flowing when you have to write,
right. I mean, writing is a skill, a practice, exercise, exercising those muscles, getting used to it. It actually works. This isn't just some kind of like God-given talent that drops into us fully formed. Even naturally talented and gifted writers get better through practice. So it sounds like, you are in no short of topics to write on, but one of the provocative statements that I've heard you make is that, as you see it, there's no such thing as writer's block. Tell me why.
Well, writer's block is a symptom. Okay. You're like, I don't know what to write. That's your problem, is you don't know what to write. Okay. So, if you have writer's block, it's because you haven't planned enough. You don't know what your topic is. You don't know what your theme is. You need to go and prepare. If you have a fat outline, you can't have writer's block, because it's like, oh, there it is. Here's the 17 things in the order they have to do. I just have to type about those things, and then I'm done. I also developed a cure for writer's block. Okay, it's extremely simple. So if you have something to say, but you feel like you have writer's block, I want you to write the following 2 words at the top of the page. Look stupid. Okay. So after that, it's funny. I learned this. I used this technique with some high school age students in a writing class that I was teaching, and it really worked. And so you write look stupid. And then you're in this frame of mind, like, I'm going to tell you. And at that point, it's like, the first thing you need to know is this. And then there's this. And then the reason for okay. And now all of a sudden you don't have writer's block anymore because you're off and running. Very important, especially if you're a student. You delete the look stupid before you turn it in. Right? But this is, it also, remember, it orients you toward the reader. You're thinking of the reader at that point. Look stupid. It's like, I'm going to show you what I know that you need to know. And so, yes, that typically will cure writer's block.
That's hilarious. I don't know. I think we're motivated by different things and have different. I'm not sure that would work for me. I think I'd be wounded by my own harshness there. But
well, I didn't say you write it and then you're done with it. Now you have a page full of stuff. Now you need to sand off the sharp edges and make it actually work.
Yeah. I love it. Well, okay. So back to your blog for a second, and then we're going to wrap. But what can you tell me? How much time do you spend? Like, so you're writing 1,000 words a day. You're starting every single blog post with "look stupid" and then deleting it. Okay.
Okay.
How much? Like, what does your writing practice actually look like?
Okay. So, it doesn't have to be 1,000 words. It just turns out that's approximately what they are. And it's interesting. So the first thing is always, the first paragraph is the whole blog. There's this problem, and here's the way to solve it. And at that point, if you read that, if you can say, oh, I want to know more about that, then you're going to get what I promised. And if you read it and you say, I don't care about that, well, good, I saved you. You don't have to read the rest of it. And at that point, I just say, here's the problem. Here's why this is the best way to solve it. Here's how to solve it. And then at the end, it's like, here's some other things to think about. Then
how much time does it take you to do that? Like how much time do you spend writing each day, or each day that you are writing?
I would say the interesting thing is it probably takes me 35 to 40 minutes to write that. And then it probably takes me another 35 to 40 minutes to edit it, because you shouldn't get the idea that I just publish whatever I type immediately. I go back and I check it. I look for typos. I change things. I change the order of things. I realize that I said something twice. I'll go look up a public domain photograph or something that I use as a graphic to illustrate it. I put in a few keywords, and then I publish it and promote it on Twitter and Facebook. Well,
Josh, that's pretty fast. I don't think I can generally write a lucid 1,000 words in 40 minutes.
You could if you started with "look stupid." I'm telling you.
Okay. Yeah.
The thing is, you have to care.
Try it.
So if I said, I mean, I want you to just do a little thought experiment here. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's suppose that you get to the end, and I know this is realistic for you. You get to the end of day, and you're like, I cannot believe this author. They're so repetitive. Everything they do, they keep repeating themselves, and it's so annoying. If they would only do this, and then you ask yourself, what's the cure for being repetitive? And you're like, well, I'll tell you. Here are the 3 things that you got to do that right off the bat will help.
No, you're right. It really does.
If you wrote that down, that would take you 35 minutes because you've been thinking about it.
You're totally right. And it comes back to having something to say. So when you're trying to generate a blog out of the ether, and you're trying to think of something that will sound clever or impressive or whatever, that kind of stuff is painful. But when if I have something to explain to someone, or I think I often joke that a lot of my best writing is the emails that I send. And I don't mean to my newsletter. I mean just to the people I work with, or to the clients that I have, here's why we're doing this, and
turn it into a blog post.
Yeah.
You just got to be careful with client confidentiality, but
no, but a lot of it is, it's just explanations of why things matter or how they work.
Yes.
And so that's a great place to start. So that makes sense. I mean, that makes sense. And so you're doing this every day. What about when you're writing your books? Do you like to write at a certain time, or do you use the Pomodoro technique? How do you do those longer writing sessions?
I don't even know what the Pomodoro technique is.
It's good. It's 20 minutes on, and then a forced break of 5 minutes, and then 20 minutes on again.
No.
It comes from this tomato shaped timer, but there's a digital version. You can do it on the internet.
That sounds great for some people and not for other people. No.
Yes.
I especially when I was writing the book, Writing Without Bullshit, I would typically write a chapter, and those were short chapters. So those were probably 2 2,000 to 3,000 word chapters. I'd write it in 1 or 2 sittings.
Mm-hmm.
And I would write it, and I'd get to the end, and I'd go to have dinner with my wife, and I'd say, I just wrote something really good, because they just felt really, really solid. And even for things that are longer, if you write in those kind of segments, it's typically better, because then you don't get yourself into this sort of, I hate myself moment when you're 3,500 words into a 4,500 word chapter, and you're like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I can't stand this. I just wrote a bunch of crap.
Yeah, and I relate to that. My problem when I'm writing is that I tend to have, if I'm not doing those simple sort of, here I'm explaining something to you type of pieces, then it's always some crazily complicated thought piece with a whole bunch of different sort of tentacles and ways into the subject, and it's painful to try. Like, it's great when you crack the nut and you figure out how to do it, but it can be paralyzing.
It's where all the planning comes in.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I take all of the notes and everything and I write a case studies are not easy to write well. And so that's like a little puzzle. What do I put first? And then how do I say it? And where do I put the quotes, and which things will I quote, and so on. And then, so that might take you 2 hours to write 700 words, but you're like, okay, that piece is done. Yeah. Okay. And then if you continue to write pieces that are intended to fit together, then usually you're in good shape. If you try and write some huge tome, a chunk at a time, and I forget who the writer was who always stopped in the middle of a sentence. That might be great for fiction, but I don't think that's right for nonfiction.
No. And that way you've got a sense of accomplishment, like you said, and you don't have to be tossing and turning and hating on yourself that you left something unfinished or unresolved.
I'll tell you something else that I don't know if it's just true of me, but I do a lot of writing in my head when I'm not writing. So, like, I like to walk. So me too. I might do an hour and a half walk. And I'm sitting there planning out what's going to happen in which order. And I'm like, oh, how about this thing, that thing? And then when I go to sit down to write, I've already solved all the problems in my head. And so that's the key, is to have thought it through. And if you don't, you can do what you said, where you just blat the whole stuff out onto the page, but then don't be surprised if it takes another complete draft to untangle it all.
And you hate every second of it. Yeah. The
Could
process.
Be.
Right.
Could be.
Okay, Josh. Well, that is such a great conversation, and you are a font of wisdom, and knowledge. What are you working on now?
Well, I have a publishing contract with Amplify, one of Maggie's competitors, which will be a book. The book is called How to Write a Business Book That Matters, a comprehensive guide for authors. So my intention is to take everything I've learned and put it in there. So this is, how do you think about ideas? If you're employed, how do you explain this to your employer? How do you deal with footnotes? How do you, what happens in the process of getting pages laid out? How do you organize a chapter? What is in the first chapter? How do you do a case study? I mean, there's all of these little problems, and I have dealt with and helped people with all of them. So my intention is that any problem that more than 3 authors have, the solution will be in this book.
Great. When's the book coming out?
That's a really good question. As I said, I've been sort of on a hiatus for a while here.
Okay. You're in the writing process now, so probably
I would say
early next year.
Yeah, it's probably a 2023 book. But if people want to keep up on that and the individual stuff that I'm doing, my blog is at withoutbullshit.com. That's just, by the way, if you're shy and you don't like using bad words, you can type Bernoff.com, my name, BERNOFF.com, and it goes the same place.
That's very thoughtful of you. Wow.
Well, sure. Yeah. I can't resist this story. I once did a workshop for an insurance company. And the day before the workshop, they said, we're uncomfortable with this word bullshit. Can you do the talk without using the word bullshit? I'm like, that's my thing. I'm writing without bullshit. And they're like, no, we want you to do that. So I took it all out of all the slides. And then at the end of it, they gave everyone a copy of my book that said Writing Without Bullshit right there on the front. And I'm like, okay, you're not fooling anyone here.
That's great.
So withoutbullshit.com or Bernoff.com. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciate it.
It was really great to get a chance to talk to you. You're one of my favorite people to work with, Maggie, and anytime.
Same.
I really hope this conversation has inspired you to give so much of your gift to the world that it expands you into your greatest possible version of yourself. Remember, it's not selfish just because we also benefit from it. And here's where I get to make a selfish request. New podcasts need all the help they can get. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and subscribe to us on your favorite platform. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Selfish Gift Podcast. And send me a DM. I'd love to hear how you're sharing your gift with the world.